But for me and for all of you and our students and alums, he is the coordinator of the Social Work Student Alliance and the liaison to all of our student organizations. And I think this year they're probably in the best shape they've ever been, and that is thanks to him. I sort of sit on the fringes, and when there's a crisis, I jump in, but I don't do the hard stuff. So, on that note, Andre has prepared two sets of PowerPoints that are the presentations, and I'm going to turn it over to him, and I look forward to the discussion later. Andre.
Thank you, Professor Wyman. Appreciate the introduction and good to see you as always. And thank you to all of our facilitators today, Dr. Johns, Kim, jury support. Thank you for the opportunity to present. A lot of my work, as Professor Wyman pointed out, is working with small groups, our student organizations. We currently have 11 active student organizations. So value add. If you'd like to be added to our email list and learn more about our student organizations, we love to have you get involved. One of the things that we really try to emphasize, a pillar of our student organizations, is peer support. And that's an extension of what we're going to be talking about today, is how to support one another in the licensure process, which is very important, right? I'm going to keep my video on so folks can see my energetic presentation. And I hope that this sets a nice foundation for you. I'd like to walk you through the best practice for setting a group, and what this looks like will be different for everybody, right? But this is kind of how we as social work professionals approach the small group formation process. So can everybody see and hear me? Just give me like a thumbs up or something, please.
Yes, everything's great on our end.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Johns. So we're going to study hard and study together. Just to point out, and again, all of these slides will be sent out as the rest of you've probably experienced in this series. So I'm not going to spend time on this right now, but the NASW did a really thorough walkthrough recently of the whole licensure process. So that's something to definitely be aware of, is start to finish what the technical aspect is. I know that this group is focused on the exam. I'm sure there's been discussion about how to get the license. We're having a session next week, kind of more in depth about the actual, like, who and what you work, interact with. So you can join us for that. But this is a great resource to kind of start if, especially if you haven't taken the exam. So today we are going to talk about the benefits and drawbacks of forming study groups. Again, I think one of the main takeaways today is do what works for you, find and do what works for you. We're going to talk about the ins and outs of group development. We're going to have some practice questions, which I'm sure you've done a lot of. You never know when those are going to come up. We're going to sharpen your skills and give you a chance. And I love when folks, if you want to put your answers in the chat, if somebody wants to come off mute and say an answer, I'd love to make this very discussion based, and we're all working towards the same goal. And similarly, love to leave plenty of time for Q&A if folks have any questions and kind of how to approach this for yourself. So let's move on. What are we doing next? Oh, we're doing a practice question. Wild practice question appears. So let's go through this really quickly, and go ahead and put your answer in the chat, come off mute, let us know what you're thinking, and we'll kind of get this rolling. So during Mrs. S's first appointment in a family agency, the social worker encourages her to express her feelings about the recent placement of her child in a residential facility for the developmentally disabled. Mrs. S, the client, talks about length instead about her physical health problems. The social worker should A, uses Mrs. S remarks about her health to identify unresolved parenting issues. B, refocus the interview on the child's behavior and the reason for residential placement. C, explore with Mrs. S how her health problems are related to the recent placement of her child. Or D, listen to Mrs. S' description of her health as the beginning of a relationship. So possible answers, can we see them in the chat? If someone wants to come off mute, I would love that. What are we thinking here for this practice question? Can somebody please read the chat so I don't miss it? unnecessarily possibly show on my screen. What's the consensus, folks?
There we go. The ones that I've seen so far are all are answer D.
Answer D.
Yeah. Oh,
All
nope,
right,
D.
congratulations, you are correct. Listen to Mrs. S description of her health as the beginning of the relationship. Again, following that procedure of what you do first, right, which I'm sure you talked about. So, and just a really quick recap before we get into study groups, the ASWB exam is 170 multiple choice questions. Only 50 of those count. 20 of those are test questions that ASWB is working on to develop for future tests. You take it at a Pearson test site. And again, if anybody has any questions about what the experience of the ASWB exam is, that's something we can also talk about. There's two types of questions: direct questions, practice knowledge, and case vignettes like we just did. And then you're referencing the generalist perspective. What is the best answer? What is the first answer? You know, you want to look for those keywords, right? And then just another really quick overview, two licenses. We have the clinical interpersonal macro practice license, which I'm sure a majority of you are going for. And then the advanced generalist license, which we kind of review as referred to as the macro license. And, you know, either which one is a valuable use of your time as a developing professional. So starting with groups, preparing to pass the exam, as I said, what works for one social worker might not work for another. Some very individual, stepping points is to take a prep course, do things like this, utilize your resources to understand the process, practice exam books, the School of Social Work has test exams, and, do your own research and discover the workflow that works for you. Study groups are a great way to get started and to continue your study habits. Two of my good friends passed the exam working together. They took courses and then they individually did study sessions. So I think something to think about is alternating or scheduling in individual study time also with a group study time as well. So study groups are very helpful. One of the biggest benefit is accountability, making sure that you're showing up for the group, whatever designate time that you meet, and bringing your exams, bringing your insight, and working through things together. That peer support is really important. I think kind of like we're going to do today, kind of having somebody to bounce off, well, what'd you get? And then that might help you sharpen and improve your practice taking skills, to have somebody to kind of bounce off ideas for. And then maybe there's some type of questions you're more comfortable with. Maybe there's some type of questions you're less comfortable with. Having that study group really helps you kind of cover the content in a more efficient group setting, feedback-oriented way, but also to improve on areas and receive feedback on areas in which you might feel less confident, right? Because the exam is multi-pronged and there's a lot to tackle. So there's a lot of benefits to study groups. The biggest drawback is you need to understand it's not a substitute for studying by yourself or studying routinely. My biggest recommendation is you use study groups to supplement your individual study time. Something else I referred to in a previous slide is Dwayne from the NASW recommended you study 1 to 2 days a week for no more than 3 to 4 hours. So doing those schedules, right? Something that I've started doing is studying on Sundays, right? Sunday study day, Sunday morning. Whether your group meets or not, you need to honor that time and your commitment, because I think at the end of the day, the best way to prepare for the exam is to study and do the exam. So, before we get into kind of the technical piece, the theoretical piece of group development, do we want to stop for maybe 1 or 2 really quick questions? I know we kind of have a smaller group, so I'd love to take advantage of that. No? Okay, no worries. We'll get to that at the end. So following a model that you might have experienced in your group theory class or your practice exam class, there's several stages to group development. There's actually 2 more stages in Tuckman's stages of group development but for the sake of brevity and for this exam prep course, I think that thinking about these 3 general stages would be most helpful. And again, I think it's stages meaning you develop from one stage to another, and there's certain organizational milestones that the groups need to reach to be able to be successful. So our topic today was forming study groups. We can explore here what study groups might function. You might do the exam questions together, review materials, a combination of both. But again, it's whatever works best for you. I want to cover how to start those study groups, right? So, and this is a key macro skill as well. Forming, storming, norming, right? Forming the group, storming it with expectations and informal structure, and then norming it by agreeing, arriving at a consensus about how the group will function. So forming is bringing the group together, finding your people. Maybe it's people on this call, bringing your team together, deciding who might best fit in the group, having an understanding of individually who your colleagues are, what their approach to the exam is, and think about, will they be successful in the group? Because ultimately, we hope that you make friends in social work school. We hope that you establish positive relationships, but when you're doing something serious like the exam, you want to make sure you're maximizing everybody's time. So in the forming stage, you're kind of, and maybe this is before the group even meets for the first time. In the forming stage, you're kind of forming that informal structure, so maybe two uses of the word form there. Said differently, you're beginning to collect everybody's ideas about what the group looks like and how it functions. And so those practical steps are really important. And these models are ways to think conceptually about how you move to one step to another. So once you've got everybody together, you kind of all made contact, say, okay, we're going to study together, and everybody's kind of consented to the group model. Again, not to replace individual studying, but to supplement and to kind of have a different functionality. Then you can move on to the storming phase, where you're discussing roles and ideas. And something that I emphasize in our student organizations is horizontal leadership. Everybody can be a leader in their own different ways. There doesn't need to be one person that's, I'm the leader, right? If that works better for your group and you want to have somebody that's kind of sending calendar invites and doing the thing, then if that's what the group decides, that's great. I personally recommend designating different roles to different people. Maybe you rotate those roles. So some things you might want to do is like, who's going to send a Zoom if you want to meet online? That might work too. If you want to meet in person at the library, who's going to book the room, right? Who's going to bring the test questions? Who might take notes? Who might check in with folks that aren't showing up? Who might, hit the group chat? That's real important, and one person can do different things. You can rotate responsibilities, but it's all about facilitating a shared understanding about what the group needs and how you can create roles and a more formal structure to meet those needs, as we say in social work, and to achieve the ultimate goal of everybody passing the exam and becoming licensed social workers. So, and something else that we really want to emphasize, and I think folks might shy away from sometimes with developing small groups, is to remember that, this is a mix of personal and professional, but as master's level social workers, we should all have developed our interpersonal skills to professional environments. And it's important sometimes to embrace constructive conflict. Groups need to come to a consensus. All groups best function democratically and making sure that everybody's perspective is heard, but at the same time, everybody is agreeing to what the group looks like. So not everybody might be happy, but taking the time to embrace those more critical conversations, again, that's kind of where the storming part comes in. Putting everybody together. Hopefully there's no conflict, but if there is, just consider it professional and mitigate everybody's concerns so you can come to an agreement. So maybe it's something is like, I want to meet virtually. Some people want to meet in person. So maybe you do a high flex where you set up somewhere where you can have a screen, or maybe you do two separate sessions. We'll have our in-person, we'll have our virtual, we'll alternate, in a state like today, with all of the Michigan weather we've been having, maybe meeting in person isn't a great idea. So you want to maybe meet virtually. That's a great benefit. So it's really just about considering what everybody's role in the group looks like and how the group wants to function. And then once you have those, more structural conversations once everybody's agreed to build the house of the group, right? Building a study group is like building a home. Everybody has to lay a brick down. Once you have the general form, then you can start norming, labeling those group expectations. Something that we talk about in macro practice are expectations and values of the group. How are folks going to function? And sometimes it's helpful to write this down formally. You know, things don't have to be as formal as like sign this contract, but you know, the purpose of things like contracts and rules and norms is so that there's a agreed upon code of conduct. So when you're moving from the storming to the norming phase, you're collectivizing everybody's ideas and then writing them down so that everybody understands. And maybe it's just as simple as making the schedule and encouraging everybody to be there. And maybe the norms aren't as, you know, rigid. Maybe it's like, okay, whoever wants to come, you want to be part of our group, you know, but it's making those decisions and giving everybody an equal opportunity to participate and be heard. So maybe there's some conflict. Again, you want to embrace a problem-solving framework. Remember, you're all in this together. You're showing solidarity. The functionality of this group and kind of how you're all joining together to tackle a shared goal of passing the exam is emblematic of how your study groups may function. And then lastly, to kind of mirror the first conversations of like who is best in the group, you know, there's many different ways to tackle the exam. I think that's one of the challenges is, again, finding what works for you. You might want to evaluate, is this working for me? Are we showing up and getting to the content, or are we taking 2 hours to chit chat and hang out, which is important, you know? Social workers like to talk. I like to talk. Sometimes you got to just be together as people. But if you're somebody that wants to show up, hit the library, get the material, get right to business, and that's not working for you, especially given a busy schedule, then maybe, you know, you respectfully phase out of the group or address the concerns. These things look different for everybody, and I hope that your experiences in class, in group projects, even in therapeutic groups or groups in a project level in your practicum, I hope that you can take those practical skills and apply it to this theoretical framework, which is something we do in social work all the time, right? And I tried to pull a theoretical framework for this presentation so that it could be applicable to everybody's individual situation. So I hope that is salient to you in this way I'm labeling this. So again, forming, bringing everybody together, storming, coming to a group consensus of what the shared norms and functions of the group are. Consider what leadership means. I often use the idea of horizontal leadership. So instead of vertical, where somebody's at top and everybody's at the bottom, horizontal leadership, where everybody's sharing responsibilities and accountability and functioning as a group, where everybody's taking a little bit of ownership in the whole group. And then norming, setting group norms, formalizing your structure, and, you know, moving on to the next step of studying. And if this is something that folks want to explore further, I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk individually. I think it's really important to be intentional with forming study groups. I know that you might have had the group project experience where it's not as intentional, and sometimes there's, you know, people, it's hard to even get started. So I hope that this framework is helpful in you moving forward if you choose to form a study group. So some key takeaways moving kind of towards those practical ideas, you know, what does this look like in practice? If you want to keep it real simple, communicate, communicate, and then communicate. And I think that this is good professional advice in general. You know, people are generally very understanding. If you take an inch, they'll give a mile, I think is the phrase, excuse me. It's the idea that you need to just let people know what's going on with you. If you're missing group, if something's not working for you, your most professional obligation is just to communicate that respectfully and professionally. And when you're doing these group forming activities, just make sure that you're empowered to communicate and have your voice heard, but in a respectful way. And so email, texting, and that's something else. Figure out how the group wants to communicate. Does everybody like using WhatsApp? Do people like using emails? Do people like using calendar invites? So having that consensus on those practical, technical items is important as well. So just kind of an outline of what you might do. Again, big takeaway here, do what works best for you, parentheses, and your group. You might meet at one place once or twice a week, you know. It might be a more stricter schedule, it might be rotating, it might be high flex, virtual. And then designate those responsibilities, who and how is everybody doing everything, excuse me. I put the little snack items here because somebody's got to bring snacks, especially if you're going to be studying for more than an hour or two. Everybody's got to, have something to eat, keep the brain power moving. So you want to think about designating responsibilities, who's going to do what, who's going to book the room at the UGL, who's going to get the tables at the coffee shop, who's going to send the Zoom link, who's going to bring the snacks, right? And then again, set expectations. This goes back to that norming phase. What are we going to do? If folks want to chit chat and be people together and say, check in, that's super important. Especially after the last couple of years of shared difficulties, I think standing in solidarity with one another is important. But sometimes you got to just get down to business. So what are the expectations for the group? That's another thing to kind of think about and to put into practice and be, again, routinely evaluating, right? So, and then just, some more practical knowledge, and I'm sure these are things that you've covered, but just, in my experience, these are best practices. You want to look for the stem of the question, those key items: first, best, should, according to the model. Look at those key indicators that set you up for the question. Understand what the question is. Is this just a recall question? What medication works best for this thing? You just got to know what that is, right? Or is it more of those applied vignette questions like we started with, and we'll do in a minute? This is your situation, here's your case, how would you best proceed? And then again, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges, it's divorcing the idea of what you would do versus what the social worker would do. And this might be helpful to think back to that first or second social work class you took, practice methods, right? Where you reviewed the plan change model, or I think that's what it's called. The beginning of introduction to assessment to termination. Following those steps, what is the first step? What is the model, right? So that's maybe one of the difficulties, is separating what your personal experience might be, which in a real life setting is what you would do, and everybody's practice procedures can be different. But when answering these exam questions, you need to refer to what would the average social worker, generalist practitioner, or clinical practitioner across the nation, what does the model, or what is the best first step? So that's something that's really important to tease out. That was a bit of information, and I hope that I touched on the study groups thing enough. I think it's important to think about some of these other ideas about how you're approaching the exam while you're beginning to form study groups, because again, you want to have an agreed consensus on how you're going to approach this important matter. So setting expectations and understanding what everybody's roles and how you're going to accomplish these exam procedures are really important. So let me pause for a second. Maybe we can answer a question or two. If there's questions in the chat, I would really appreciate it if one of my colleagues could read them aloud.
I do not, what do you mean I'm muted? I'm not, can you hear me? Yes, no? Yes? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, my thing says looks like I'm not. So I don't see any questions in the chat. So I'll just stay here in case there are, but someone may have a question for you directly.
Hi, this is Natalie. Are there people in the group who would like to put their names in the chat if they'd like to form? How do we get together in doing groups? And how many people would you suggest in a study group?
So great question and great application of what we just discussed. You're forming the group, you're forming that informal structure, and asking people on this call who you may have a rapport with, or at least are motivated to move to that next step in the exam, sending them some emails. If folks want to drop their emails in the chat, so our student here can get in contact and start forming the study group. I know that the series is almost over. That's a great thing to leave the series on. A great next step. I think that smaller groups tend to function better especially with something like this where you need to be collectivizing individual perspectives. Everybody's going to approach things a little differently. So then to arrive at a shared consensus about how everybody's going to approach it, if you have 20 people, that probably isn't going to work out super well. Maybe that is, what you need, and to have a wide range of perspectives. So, I think maybe like 3 to 5 would be a good target number. Because then, there's a practicality here too. There's a, organizational piece. If you want to meet in person, get in a room in the library or Starbucks for 10 people, it's going to be difficult. Think about when you have a big table at a restaurant, right? But maybe that is what works for the needs of the group. So, and I think sometimes it's good to put a bigger invitation out. Maybe you invite everybody that was just on this session. We have a handful of folks. Maybe only a smaller handful of people will reply. And then you move from there to organize. Maybe you'll meet and then start studying. It's up to the needs and desires of the group. I think what's most important is starting by communicating, identifying who you might work well with, and then analyzing what you want to get out of that experience.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Great question. Other folks, I would love to hear from somebody else. I hope that this was beneficial. Well, I know I just did an amazing job, so maybe there's not questions for that reason. And I know it's Friday, So we're gonna, something that we will always need your input on. Another practice question appears. Let's read through these really quickly, and then we can have some closing thoughts and maybe any more final percolating thoughts or questions. So love to hear your answers in the chat or aloud. I think it's important that we continually do these. At the end of the day, mirroring and understanding what the exam studying is going to be a lot of answering the test questions. So which of the following assumptions is not accepted by a social worker engaged in family treatment? A, each person strives for a sense of relatedness and closeness with others. B, targeting the scapegoated family member will help the rest of the family. C, family members explain their own sense of worth on the basis of the behavior of others. Or D, family boundaries are the means for individuals to protect their differences and maintain identity. So, great question, very meaty. Let me just give you a little bit of assistance. You want to focus on that word not. And that's another key study tip that I'm sure you have covered. How you're reading the question is probably half the battle. So answers, please, and thank you.
I was gonna say B.
I got a couple of B's in here, a few.
We got B's.
3. I mean, not that many, but 3 people have answered. Oh no, 4. Hold on. Yeah, 4 so far.
One would be.
Mhm.
So B, looks like B is the consensus. Wow.
Or D, but I think B.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Erica. So it seems like this practice course has been worth your time and attention because you all got it right. B,
Yay.
treating the scapegoated family member will help the rest of the family. So this is tricky. Again, this is that linguistics reading the question. Treating the scapegoated family member will help the rest of the family. It's a family therapy. You'll want to include everybody, right? So again, there's a lot of little nooks and crannies that you want to make sure, but I think everybody here seems really sharp on how to do that. So maybe these are people you should form a study group with. Yeah, so I think that, great job. I think that was a good example of how everybody should approach these questions. So let's do one more. And being a former emo kid, this one I enjoy. A man brings his 16-year-old son to a therapy appointment to have him assessed for depression. His son has started wearing black and has dyed his blonde hair black. The boy denies he's depressed and says that all his friends dress the way he does. According to Eric Erickson's stages of psychosocial development, what crisis is the client experiencing? So just again, walk through some things. Eric Erickson's stages of psychosocial development. That's something that you'll need to study. That's an important model. I know that that's covered in our Wayne State curriculum. Is the client experiencing? Who's the client? Is it dad? Is it the son? And he's 16, so we want to take that into consideration. So here's our answers. Industry versus inferiority. B, intimacy versus isolation. C, identity versus role confusion. Or D, autonomy versus shame and doubt. So,
Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, it looks like 4 C's, Andre.
C,
That's what we've got
identity
here.
versus
Mhm.
role confusion.
5.
5,
I say C.
C's, versus role confusion. And I
Yeah.
think that word identity probably stood out to some folks. But then again, this is a good example of one of those recall questions. Do you know Eric Erickson's stages of psychosocial development? That's a very key social work model. So are you familiar with that? So yeah, that is our presentation for the day. Let me just leave you with some words of positive affirmation. You got this. I know that your licensure process is a journey. There's probably a lot of highs and lows, but at the end of the day, Wayne State Warriors will always prevail. They will always be warrior strong. And even if you're not from Wayne State, I hope you've taken from this sessions that everybody can be warrior strong, be a social work warrior. And the reason that we need the licensure is to be able to best deliver effective and ethical practice to the people that we serve. And that's why we do this at the end of the day, right? So stay motivated, try and stay positive as much as possible, lean on your peers, which is, I hope, something that you've taken from today's presentation. And you got this, you got this. I know it can be sort of defeating. I know that sometimes folks, there's things that can be demotivating, but at the end of the day, you have to lean on your peers and talk yourself up to know that you are awesome, you are smart, and you got this, you got this. So that is our session for the day. Thank you for your time and attention. These presentation slides will be sent, as well as I believe the video recording. So this will all be available for your reference.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Andre.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Warrior Strong.
Warrior strong, yes, 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 yes. And even if you're not a warrior, I, as an alum and an employee, you are now all Wayne State Warriors. Congratulations.
Social work strong.
Yes, social work strong, wonderful. And thank you, Dr. Johns, and everybody else that's put this series on. Given everything, the discussion with the licensure exam, I think our School of Social Work is trying really hard to address this in a really hands-on way and get you the support you need to cross that finish line. So, love to have a small clicks or round of applause for all the facilitators for these sessions. I hope I'm sure they have been very helpful. And thank you for allowing me to present. It's been an honor. That wasn't necessarily the cue to leave, but happy to keep discussing.
There was a hand up, Andre,
I'm sorry?
I think from Tina.
Yes. Any questions, discussion points? Oh, a lot of positivity in the chat. Wonderful. Yeah, any suggestions, reflections, just love to give space to hear from folks. And then if I just again did a great job and this hit and you don't have any questions, maybe Dr. or Professor Weinman would like to talk just a little bit about recent developments with the exam.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. I think my question is always the same. Are there any people here who are macro? I would be interested in that. And Tina, are you?
No, a micro family
Okay.
system. Yep.
Family system. So one of the things that we have faced for many years is the macro cohorts and contingents who graduate with their MSWs and then have to take an exam that is not designed for them. And so there's been an increasing number of macro professionals who just don't take the exam. So I'm glad to hear that that won't be one of your dilemmas. But if you don't know, there has been a survey conducted by the ASWB, which is the Association of Social Work Boards. It is downloadable. You can just look it up right on Google, ASWB survey. And it has caused more than a small amount of discussion throughout the country in terms of different states and what their licensing requirements are. I think you know that we do not have what we call reciprocity. So like someone like me, who spent their whole career primarily in New York, I am licensed in New York, and the New York licensing procedure is such that when you are licensed for life. But if you want to do clinical work, you have to take an additional exam. It's very similar. In Illinois, they have done away with the exam right after graduating, and yet they still have the procedures for becoming a clinical practitioner. So I would simply suggest that you stick to, read whatever the school sends out, look at NASW, look at the ASWB. There is a very strong movement to change the way some of our licensing works. I will say this to the Wayne folks, because we've had this data from Michigan. The data in Michigan, which I think the last one I saw had pass rates for Michigan, Michigan State, Western, and Wayne. And it was not a pretty picture. So this test itself was found to be racist, ageist, what else? What am I missing here? Biased against folks whose first language is not English. And this is not something that we in our profession, particularly given our code of ethics, can just settle by saying it's okay. So I think you'll be hearing more about it as alums. I know that our dean is hoping to get the word out. What we can do yet, I don't know. So from your perspective, I hope that you're all able to put these groups together. They're important. And, we're always here if you want to get involved in any other ways, or if you know macro people who are. But you can download that study and be aware that there is discussion at NASW National as well as the 50 local ones to see how to create a more inclusive exam. I think that's all I wanted to say, unless there's any questions.
Judith, there's not I don't know if it's a question, but a comment from Carmen said it's a dilemma for her. She's a school social worker and she does not have hospital practice or experience. So I don't know if it's something you can address in that nature.
Well, yes, Carmen, yeah, she hit the nail on the head. What happens is that we often get set in certain areas, particularly schools. You have to go through a whole accreditation process. Getting to be a school social worker is not that easy. And I hope this is the answer, Carmen. And then when it comes time to study for the exam and take the exam, I will tell you personally that when I saw, now I know I don't look like it, but I've been out of school 40 years already. And I saw the Eric Erickson question, but, oh God, rats, what don't I remember? So it's not just people who are out for 6 months or a year. So Carmen, I think, again, unless this changes, and I don't know how long you've been out of school or what, but it is, I think the group study process is probably the smartest way to go, because hopefully you will have people there who do work in other settings who can help you answer those questions. That is a tough one. Most of us could not go into schools and simply practice social work. On the other hand, the licensing exams don't necessarily say, okay, this we're going to have a lot of school social work questions on it. And I believe, I don't know if Chantilly is still here, but I believe that when the exam, each time they give the exam, it's another exam. It's not the same one somebody took a month ago. So I don't know if that answers your question, Carmen, if you want to ask me another question, but yes, we see that there's a lack of experience that helps you be more able to answer the questions. Yeah, good. I see people here who were my students, so I want to say hello to you. Bilkis, hello, how are you, dear? I just can't resist. I don't know who. In the hours. Oh, that's a good question. Do you know, Andre? I can't imagine you couldn't. Can you get, yes, do supervision hours count if they're virtual? I can't imagine they wouldn't.
So, in full disclosure, this is not a question that I have
No, I don't either.
100% knowledge to say. But given my understanding of the technical licensure process, yes. Because what is the difference between meeting with somebody in person and meeting someone virtually outside of the format, you know? And given just today's day and age, I think it would be remiss if we did not count virtual hours. So I am with 90% accuracy that virtual hours count. Now, what's important is that they're certified and supervised by a LMSW licensed macro social worker that has experience in your field. So it's less about, are you doing things virtually or in person? It's more about, are you doing things that are relevant to your license? And do you have an LMSW who you can submit your hours to the state? So, you know, even for my own licensure journey, I do a lot of stuff online. I did this online. I do a lot of small group meetings, and if they're not counting virtual hours, that would be a big bummer. So I have to imagine that they would. I think it would be short-sighted for them not to. I mean, I say with fairly accurate certainty that they would. Telehealth, you know, it's the new emerging practice model. Now, again, what's important to differentiate what counts and what doesn't is what is being supervised by a licensed social worker. So just to give you a very brief example of how important that is for my practicum experience as a macro social work student, my practice supervisor for my first placement was not licensed. She was an MSW, but she was not licensed. So they then contracted out another social worker to come in and supervise my hours, which something, you know, again, this gets to the idea of, do you have an LMSW at your job? Something that Dwayne talked about in the lecture that I posted in the beginning of these slides is negotiating for that when you're applying for jobs, you know, because you need those 4,000 hours of work experience as well. Do you have an LMSW on staff? Is that something that they can compensate you for if you have to contract out to an LMSW? You know, it's an important piece of supervision, is one of the most important pieces of the licensure journey outside of the exam, getting those work hours. So long answer in summary, I believe so. I would assume so.
Okay.
And the licensure, and I think Professor Wyman is looking it up.
But
You know,
no,
I don't know, what would the difference be, you know?
what
That's
I'm
a really
looking
good
up
question.
is the technology standards, which are new and include, I just saw, but interesting, I can't, well, we can look. Standard 4.12 of the technology standards under section 4 is about social work supervision, but it does not go into supervision for licensing. However, the technology standards are very detailed around, for example, telehealth kinds of things. So those are accepted social work practices now. I would be surprised. I just can't get it to move on my screen. But I also think that someone like Anwar would know if anyone wants the question more thoroughly answered. But the first thing I would check is the technology standards. Can you see it, Andre?
Um,
Oh, you're not
no,
looking at it.
I
Okay.
don't want to close out of this window, but again, I think that's a
Yeah.
great place. And if you a great place to answer that question, again, we're having a licensure session as part of our professional development week at the School of Social Work on the 21st. So if you go to events.wayne.edu, you should be able to search and register for that. We'd love to see you there, and that would be an excellent place to ask that question. If
Hold on, I got something.
Tina, okay, yeah.
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 Field instruction. Yeah,
Tina,
I mean,
just go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. I'm not gonna, I'll mute myself.
Yeah, I don't want to don't want to say anything for certain because I don't have a concrete data in front of me. But again, given strong inference, I would say yeah, virtual hours count. And so Tina dropped in the chat, kind of based on what I was just talking about, a very helpful thing, which I hope that everybody writes down, is if you don't have supervision at your place of employment, so you're working at X community mental health agency, you're having a great job, you're seeing clients, but you don't have an LMSW to certify your hours, which you literally send to the state on a regular basis, then members of the NASW, National Association of Social Workers Michigan, who is leading the charge on a lot of the current licensure efforts, and you can refer back to in my PowerPoint presentation, they apparently offer outside supervision connections through the NASW. So if you're looking for a supervisor, the NASW is a great place to start. And if you are just looking for general resources on the NASW or on the ASWB licensure exam, the NASW is a great place to start, in addition to your School of Social Work, things like this as well. A lot of social work acronyms. Again, it's its own little language, as I tell students sometimes. So summary points: use groups effectively, follow models to move down the process of group development, find out what works for you and your group. That's a key part of the group formation process. Evaluate continuously, communicate, and have shared goals that can help the group work effectively to achieve the ultimate outcome of everybody passing the exam. And if somebody doesn't pass the exam, how can you as a fellow colleague and hopefully as a friend better support them? I think peer support is one of the most amazing underutilized resources within our social work profession, especially out of school. I think we are a little more afraid to tap on shoulders when we're in the job market. So, you know, another major thing to take away is lean on one another. You're all in this together. Us social workers have to stick together. We have a unique place in the world, so help each other out, you know. And don't be afraid to ask questions. There is no such thing as a silly question. No such thing.